Hello, Cardinals. It's me, Mr. Ernst, and today we're going to be talking about the parts of a scatter plot. So what I mean by that is when we're looking at the parts of a scatter plot, this is a scatter plot. Of course, the points are all kind of scattered all over the place. And we're going to be looking at these 5 specific parts of the scatter plot because they all kind of represent different parts of the data, okay? The first one we're going to start off with is the trend line. Again, trend lines for us are going to be straight, linear lines. So I'm basically going to be grabbing just a line tool and trying to grab a nice straight line through the data to show where it is trending. But that's a pretty good trend line right there. Again, trend line is a line that kind of cuts through the data and we can use to kind of make predictions about other points that we can't necessarily see. Linearity. This is directly related to the trend line. Essentially, if you can draw a straight line through it, then it has good linearity to it. So yes, this is a linear line. So we have linear, and we have our trend line. Positivity. This graph is moving in a upwards direction. It is moving upwards, so this would be a positive graph. It is moving in a positive direction. It has a positive correlation. Outliers. Outliers are points that kind of deviate from the rest of the data. So you have like these big chunks of points here, and outliers are points that are far away from most of the data. So for example, you've got this guy way up here. That would be an outlier. And then you got this point way down here. That would be an outlier. And even this point that's kind of popped off of the side here, this also could be considered an outlier. So we've got about 3 outliers on this graph. The last one is clusters. A cluster is a really tight group of points that basically tells you where really strong data is. So here's a good cluster right here. That's a really tight group of points, right about there-ish. And then this would also be a really good cluster right here. So that's another good cluster, okay? So again, we got all of these different things here. We have our red trend line. This is a linear graph. I could draw a straight line through it. It is a positive graph because it's moving in an upwards direction. The outliers are circled in purple. Those are the ones that kind of are separate from most of the data. And then the clusters are the really tight groups of data. Cool? Boop. Oh, whoops, that's not what I wanted. Boop. All right, next graph. Boop, boop. Graph number 2. Once again, starting off with our trend line. This time, a positive one, this direction doesn't seem to match this very well because I'm going to be missing a lot of the points. However, it does look like I can put a rough trend line down this way. Notice these points are a lot more separate than our original one. So we have our trend line. Next up, linearity. Again, it's okay. I would say this is okay linearity because it's roughly following the line, but it's not really super close to it. It's okay. It's okay linearity. Positivity. This one, in this case, it is going downwards. The graph is moving in a downwards direction. So the positivity for this one would be negative. This would be a negative graph. Outliers, points that are way far away from the rest of the points. This is a good outlier. This is a good outlier. These ones kind of, but they are a little bit chunky, so they're kind of close. And these ones all at least have some kind of little buddy with them to kind of keep them here. So we only got 2 outliers this time. Lastly, so we got our outliers, and lastly we have our clusters. Here's a really good cluster here. Good cluster here, here. There's no real limitation on how many clusters you want to circle. You're basically looking for the strongest points. We know here is the strongest amount of data right here in the center of this scatter plot. Okay? And that would be our clusters. Third graph. Once again, starting off with our trend line. No, this one doesn't really have a correlation. There's no real direction that this one is going. There's no real direction this one seems to be moving in. So for this one, we do not have a trend line. There is no trend line for this graph. If there is no correlation, then there's no trend line. Same thing with linearity. If we can't draw a line through it, if we can't make a trend line through it, it's not something that's linear. It's not moving in a straight line anywhere. It's just a big blob here. Positivity. Again, There is no positivity here. It's not positive, it's not negative. This is simply 0. There is 0 positivity. It's not going up, it's not going down. It is 0 positivity. All right, outliers. We do still have a couple of outliers. This one is an outlier, sitting really far away from most of the data, and we could probably call this one an outlier as well. As long as you can kind of justify why you think those are outliers, then you could, basically justify it. Honestly, even these two, that could be a pair of outliers there, you could say those are outliers as well. So those are our outliers. Again, the points that are far away from the rest of the data. And then finally, our clusters are really tight groups of data. We have a pretty good cluster here, kind of makes a little T shape. We got a good cluster of data here, and that's kind of it. Like, that's the closest thing we have. This is not good data here. So if we were collecting data on something, this tells us that there is not a good lab result. So if we were testing, let's say, two different things, X and Y, we can see that there is really no correlation between whatever these two variables might be, okay? So that happens sometimes. You will just have a graph that's a scatter plot that does not have a lot of these going on. All right, our last one, graph number 4. Once again, starting off with our trend line. This one's a little tricky, because remember, trend line has to be straight. So if I can follow like this first part going up, but I can't curve it. So this one actually can't have a trend line. There is no trend line for this graph. Because again, the trend line has to be straight, and I cannot feasibly draw a straight line that's going to cover most of these points. It would have to come up, it would have to curve and come back down. But a trend line has to be straight. It can't bend like this. So there is no trend line for this. Linearity. This is also not a linear graph. This would be considered, this is considered non-linear because it curves. The path of the graph curves, so this would be non-linear. Positivity. We could say that the first part of the graph going upwards is going to be positive, and then it becomes negative. So this one would actually be both positive and negative. It would go up, and then it comes down. Positive and negative for this one. And then our final couple parts here. The outliers. But outliers, any points that kind of fall out of it, honestly, I'm not seeing a lot of points. They basically fall within this same thing here. There's no random point sitting here, so we don't have any outliers this time. That happens. Sometimes your data is just pretty dang good, and you can't find any outliers. Clusters, though. We do have clusters. Here's a good cluster here. Good cluster here. You can even maybe argue that that's a little cluster. That's a cluster. Again, there's no limit on how many clusters you want to put together, as long as you're not identifying this as a cluster. That would not be a cluster. That's not a cluster. So we got about four clusters, roughly, and maybe if you want to get this one as well, 4 rough clusters there, okay? So we do have a few clusters, no outliers. This one is positive and negative. It is nonlinear, and finally, it has no trend line, because again, it goes up and down, okay? So that is the 5 main parts of a scatter plot: the trend line, linearity, positivity, outliers, and clusters. Thanks for watching.